Hey y'all, my name is Michelle Tucker. I'm currently a junior at the University of Texas at Austin, and I am enrolled in a childhood and development class right now where I am learning about inequity issues. And for this project, I actually decided to focus on the equity issue of ableism, specifically deafness and deaf education. And through this, I interviewed a family member of mine who's actually fully deaf, and I started the interview off by asking her what life looks like through her eyes and what accommodations are offered to her in order to provide equity. And she basically says that life looks the same through her eyes as it does everyone else's. She obviously cannot hear what goes on in the world, but she uses vibrations to put pieces together and in a way make her own story as to where that vibration could be coming from. She also does sign, and she goes on to say that she thinks she thinks about it constantly how she would talk if she could hear noises rather than what she's learned through just feeling vibrations. And then as for accommodations, she says they're minimal and that every business, corporation, and company needs to do better. She's gotten used to it by now, but she thinks about all the people in the world who aren't born deaf, but rather suddenly experience a loss of hearing. And she thinks about how tough it must be to have that hearing just be taken away from you and have to start from square one on how you're going to continue facing life head on. And through this, I actually connected this with one of the discussions in class talking about how many accommodations are limited and how they're, especially just for any kind of disability, there's always better accommodations that could be done by people, peers, teachers, friends, etc. And she goes on to state how in regards to agency, she felt as though she grew up with little to no agency or the ability to kind of grow on her own and think on her own, because so many of these adult figures in her life constantly saw her deafness as being a disability and something that would get her hurt or in trouble or hold her back, so they would constantly do things for her. So she feels as though she was stripped of agency at a really young age, and through that, she also had her play very limited, because when she would find things to do, especially with her peers and classmates or even friends, a lot of the times they wouldn't take the time to understand what differentiated her from them, especially at a young age. Children are very blunt and they can't really just say, or some of them don't really understand that what makes somebody different can't always just be explained. So when she was younger, having to make friends was a little difficult because not many people would take the time to figure out how to communicate with her in a way that was formally speaking. Like, they wouldn't learn to sign, they wouldn't learn to just find ways to speak to her. So she feels as though her play was also just extremely limited. The second question I asked her was, would you change anything about being deaf? Do you consider a disability? And she basically says, I already altered my deafness, and she has a cochlear implant. She says, I think it levels the environment with my loss of hearing and allows for me to get through my day-to-day. Hearing is incredible. Conversations create connection. A cochlear helps me get closer to creating those connections with people who may not be able to sign. So to answer the follow-up question, she does consider it a disability. And although she's altered her deafness through cochlear implants, she doesn't consider either of those things to be negative. She's happy to be who she is, especially now that she's an adult. But when she was younger, it was a lot different. She really she wanted to hear so badly, and she wanted to be able to speak properly. And it took her years of speech therapy to fully be able to even make it easier for those around her to understand her, rather than having others take the time to understand where she's coming from and what her disability actually means for her. And the final question I asked her was, how do people treat you before they make the connection that you're deaf? Are they understanding most of the time? Do they ever surprise you? And she does say that she is often surprised by people or strangers she has conversations with. Some of the time, she does mention how when she goes to Starbucks, there have been multiple baristas who actually notice the cochlear and are able to start signing. She does say, I'd say it seems like younger people who are more considerate and respectful when figuring out that she's disabled. Her niece, who doesn't sign, will always type everything out for her, which is just another one of the ways that you can advocate and understand the disability of being deaf. Everybody has a phone nowadays. It's really easy to kind of just go in your notes and create something and communicate with a person just by showing them what you want to say. And I actually connected this with one of the discussions in Professor Adair's class, where she talks about how people don't really take the time to understand what a disability actually means, and how there's so many ways to properly communicate with somebody, especially in this case, like somebody who's deaf, that just a lot of people don't take the time to do and rather just pity. And when I was interviewing my family member, she did say that she's been mocked before, and when a lot of people find out she's deaf, they kind of turn to this very like sorrowful mood, and they just look like they feel bad for her, and she wishes that people would stop doing that and just there's so many ways to communicate to her or understand that with a cochlear she's able to pick up better, but that doesn't mean that she can fully hear, and a lot of people tend to think that's exactly what it means. So another way she said that I myself and others can advocate for like proper deaf education is understanding that cochlears and alterations and surgeries that help guide deafness in a way don't always mean that they can automatically hear. Some people who are deaf can read lips and some can't, but you can't automatically make that assumption. And through the reading in class, it was called Reconceptualizing Assistance for Young Children of Color with Disabilities in an Inclusion Classroom. This reading discusses how agency and like the development of a child can be really impacted by what others have to say and outsider influences. And one of the quotes I really enjoyed through this was actually the pathologization of the play on the part of disabled children is closely tied to the normalization of childhood, in which non-normal bodies are increasingly expected to be governed and corrected by professionals. And I related this strongly to my interviewee, who literally exclaimed how when she grew up, she was so confined by these strict rules from her teachers, adults, and even family members at some point who didn't want her to do anything her way because they were so worried that she wouldn't be able to simply because of her disability. And they acted like it would be the end of the world if she were to grow a form of agency or her own mind. And then a second reading came from Emancipating Play and Disabled Children, Development and Deconstruction by Dan Goodley and Catherine Runswick-Cole, where they actually say the quote, reconceptualizing practices that can support young children of color with disabilities to be more fully themselves can actually just create a better environment for both ends, those who are disabled versus those who are fully abled, to more connect with each other on a level that both ends are able to clearly understand where the other side is coming from. And this related to my interview because she does talk about how she wishes more people would take the time to just simply educate themselves on what being disabled means, and it's not. And to every disabled person, they might not think that their disability is something that disables them, but rather ables them even further. And furthermore, that's pretty much everything that I learned through creating this project, and I plan on posting this video to the public while also sharing the link to this video in hopes that a lot of college students, preferably at UT, will be able to kind of enhance their knowledge on disabilities and the equity issue of being ableist. So yeah, thank you.